Greetings, everyone. My name is John Gidongo. I'd like to welcome you to this Elephant podcast on our latest theme of alcohol, tobacco, and drugs. About 17 years ago, I decided I had enjoyed enough alcohol for a lifetime and gave it up. But like many Kenyans, enjoy it I did, sometimes too much. Following Kenya's media, especially over the past decade, a hysteria has built up around alcohol and drug discussions. This excitement is particularly noticeable when debate is centered on drugs at the coast, the consumption of illicit brews in Nairobi and Central Province, and more recently, advocacy regarding the legalization of marijuana in Kenya. In this podcast, I'll be talking about the issue of drugs mostly here in Kenya. I will try and paint a historical context of how traditional drugs were consumed in our societies. I'll then aim to illustrate the chronological changes of regulation and public perception in the traditional, colonial, and present-day eras. Importantly, I'll ask, do we have a crisis? If we do, what does it look like? Where is it? Who is most impacted by it? And what can or can't we do about it? Alcohol. Contrary to the perception sometimes commonly created that Kenyans are especially hard drinkers, according to the World Health Organization, South Africans are the continent's largest consumers of alcohol. In the region, Ugandans drink an average of 23.7 liters of alcoholic beverages per year per person, followed by the Burundians and Rwandese who drink 22 liters. Kenyans drink 18.9 liters and Tanzanians 18.4 liters per person per year. The WHO ranks Kenya 24th on the African continent in terms of alcohol consumption and 121st globally. So in a sense, we really don't have a crisis on this front if the statistics are to be believed. One may even stretch the analysis and argue that consumption is related more to trauma than tribe between countries and within countries. It is almost as if the more violent coups and other dislocations in the past, the more men in particular drink. Home-brewed organic alcoholic beverages were common in many African non-Muslim communities prior to the onset of colonialism. They were mostly fermented with an alcohol content of between 2 and 4%, and especially associated with a variety of rituals and communal occasions. Colonial efforts to restrict and manage alcohol consumption was actually part of the agenda of the infamous 1890 Berlin Conference that set the scramble for Africa in motion by European powers, with an express commitment to, quote-unquote, drive out noxious trade in spirituous liquors. This was perhaps among the most unsuccessful colonial policy propositions ever. Indeed, across Africa, the potency of alcohol brewed and sophistication of brewing techniques increased and improved in direct proportion to colonial and missionary attempts to regulate them. The colonial introduction of maize and sugar, competing with sorghum and millet in the economy, increased alcohol content in alcoholic beverages to between 6 and 8%. Africans continued to brew and consume alcoholic beverages, both indigenous and with techniques learned especially by African soldiers returning from the First World War. These led to alcohol distillation methods that dramatically increased the potency and variety of beverages available, just as the colonialists were trying to, quote-unquote, control native alcohol consumption. In Kenya, the so-called native gin was chang'aa, Tanzania's was konyagi, and Uganda's was waraji. In Rwanda and Burundi, they drank a banana-derived wine, urwarwa, and urwagi beer. Professor Charles Ambler's Drunks, Brewers and Chiefs, Alcohol Regulation in Colonial Kenya, 1900 to 1939, details what colonial officials, despite a paucity of evidence, described as an epidemic of drunkenness, and that, quote-unquote, drinking made Africans both unpredictable and dangerous in the process of eroding the veneer of obeisance that made control possible. Periods of rigorous alcohol regulation coincided with heightened political and social unrest. Attention was especially placed on the role of drinking in discouraging young men from engaging in wage labor. From 1907 onwards, colonial authorities attempted, largely unsuccessfully, to legislate against alcohol production and consumption. From 1930 onwards, a more comprehensive regulatory regime was implemented. The generally sensationalized posture of the colonial regime to African alcohol consumption was carried over into the post-independence period. Soon after he took office in 1978, for example, President Moi called for the prohibition of the informal brewing and consumption of beer and distilled alcoholic beverages. A Chang'an Prohibition Act commenced in 1980, and the Alcohol Drinks Control Act of 2010 was aimed at transforming this regulatory environment. Considerable hyperbole attends to Chang'an consumption in Kenya, especially its impact on the youth in urban areas. Media reports of drinkers getting seriously ill, going blind, and being killed after consuming adulterated Chang'an regularly capture the public imagination. Anecdotally, many of these incidents take place in Nairobi, central and eastern provinces, and more recently in the former Rift Valley. In fact, Chang'an consumption in central province is presented as a crisis afflicting young men in particular. The National Authority for the Campaign Against Alcohol and Drug Abuse, NACADA, a state corporation established in 2012, reported the same year, in their Rapid Assessment on Drug and Substance Abuse report, that 7.2% of Nairobi residents drank Chang'an, making them the highest consumers in the country, followed by Western Province at 7.1%, Nyanza 6.2%, Rift Valley 5.5%, Eastern 2.1%, Coast 1.3%, Central 0.5%, and Northeastern 0%. Yes, 0.5% in Central. These official statistics are at wide variance with national perceptions. One explanation may be what they put into distilled alcohol in places like Central. Compounds like methanol and formaldehyde have been reported as being used to adulterate Chang'an in Central and Nairobi. So while in Nyanza and Western, they drink Chang'an, in parts of Nairobi and Central, they are literally drinking poison. It is also important to observe that there are regional dynamics to all statistics on alcohol consumption. In many regions, the majority of women, Muslims, and other religious groups, adolescents, etc., do not consume alcohol. It is possible, therefore, that the sliver of the population consuming distilled alcohol can be quite small, and the effects far more blatantly deleterious to this group. Among this group, there is a crisis if the 18.9 liters of alcohol consumed by every Kenyan annually is being drunk by only a relatively small percentage of the population, and the potency has been on the rise non-stop since colonial times. In overall alcohol consumption, according to NACADA, Nairobi reported the highest proportion of those who drink at 22%, followed by the Rift Valley at 15.7%, Eastern 14.6%, Nyanza 12%, Coast 10.6%, Western 10.2%, Central 10%, and Northeastern 5.6%. Clearly, there's a significant disconnect between the perception and reality if the government's own statistics are to be believed. This has had a distortionary effect on policy, with politicians engaging in regular populist crackdowns against alcohol brewing and consumption. Miraa. The previously most commercially successful drug to ever come out of Kenya globally was khat or miraa. The flesh from the stems of the plants is chewed for their mild narcotic effect, and miraa is said to counter sleep, expand the imagination, among other qualities. Those who chew it stand out because of the huge bulge in their cheek as they patiently and tirelessly chew over hours to achieve and sustain the desired effect. A WHO report in the mid-1960s concluded that while miraa had similar effects to amphetamines, the toxic psychosis as a result of abuse is much less frequent with khat than with amphetamines. Originally from the Oromo region of Ethiopia, Miraa was chewed ritualistically and for a myriad of other purposes. It is grown intensively in the Nyambene Hills of Kenya. By 1917, British officials posted to Meru reported that miraa was being sent to the military and administrative posts scattered throughout the northern frontier district by some of their employees for consumption by the African colonial soldiers and policemen. By the mid-1920s, it was reaching new markets in Nairobi and Mombasa. By 1945, after more localized regulatory attempts, a bill to control the sale, cultivation, and consumption of miraa had been drafted. After resistance from Meru elders, the bill was amended to allow permits to be issued for the sale and consumption of khat beyond Embu and Meru, so long as the permits were issued only to so-called habitual consumers. Business people were required to apply for a permit to supply khat to quote-unquote addicts. People who broke the law were liable to fines of up to 2,000 shillings and or imprisonment for up to 12 months. The Meru and Embu had legal monopoly on khat cultivation. After independence, an international market in the Horn of Africa, the Gulf, and into Europe and wider grew. In 2014, the United Kingdom, the key European transshipment point for miraa, banned the product. By then, about 2,500 tons a year were being exported into the UK, accruing 2.5 million British pounds in taxes to the British Treasury. In 2010 alone, over 13 billion shillings was remitted to Kenya as a result of the export of miraa. The ban has had a major economic impact. In Africa, tobacco began when it was imported from America by the Portuguese. They brought it from their one-time Brazilian colony to their settlements on the West African coast around the turn of the 17th century. Tobacco soon replaced bangi as the drug of choice. It eventually helped that it didn't have the legal and social encumbrances of cannabis, despite what has been found to be utterly devastating health consequences from especially long-term smoking of tobacco. The tobacco industry remains by far the most politically aggressive and influential in terms of policy making, despite the setbacks of the last decade. Tobacco use in Kenya is at 12% prevalence amongst urban and 7.4% among rural residents. According to NACADA, 16% of Kenyan males smoke and only 2% of females. Kenya's northeastern province has the highest reported level of current use of tobacco at 16.1%, followed by Nairobi at 14.4%, Central at 10.5%, Coast at 9.7%, Eastern at 9%, Rift Valley at 8.2%, Nyanza 3.8%, and Western at 3.0%. Kenya is actually pretty progressive in terms of tobacco regulation compared to many other jurisdictions in the developing world. The country became a party to the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control on February 27, 2005, and the Tobacco Control Act was passed in 2007, and its accompanying Tobacco Control Regulations 2014 was finally passed despite major industry lobbying in 2016. Aromatic shisha tobacco, smoked via a hookah water pipe, has become increasingly popular with the millennial generation, especially in urban centers like Nairobi and Mombasa. While cigarettes have lost their allure, shisha is cool. Research carried out by the World Health Organization and reported on in 2016 found that the volume of smoke inhaled in an hour-long shisha session is estimated to be equivalent to smoking between 100 and 200 cigarettes. A NACADA study conducted nationwide and released in 2014 found that 19% of shisha samples consumed were laced with opiates like heroin. Marijuana, aka bangi. Cannabis sativa is the oldest known regularly consumed psychoactive plant. It is also the most politicized drug in the developed world. In Kenya, it is known by its Hindi-derived name bangi. which comes from bang, which means the stems and branches of the plant. Ganja, another Hindi name, means the leaves, and hashish means the resin. Bangi is also the most stigmatized drug widely consumed in much of East Africa. In Kenya, it is also known as dhom, weed, dom, Solomon's herb, boza, stundu, ganja, ngwai, tembo, ombitho, kush, injaka, omusala, shash, Mary Jane, kikoro, shada, kivela, hemp, and kabis, among others. It grows in many parts of the world and is successfully cultivated in a range of soil types and climates. In Kenya, cultivation is prevalent in the Lake Victoria Basin and Mount Kenya region, according to the United Nations Office for Drug Control. It is believed that the area under cultivation has been growing. In ancient times, marijuana was known to have been used in religious rituals, as well as in medicinal preparations. It was highly revered amongst users for its ability to improve the mood, alter perception and consciousness, as well as treating symptoms such as nausea, respiratory ailments, fever, and pain. According to NACADA, in Kenya, 1.7% of the population in Nyanza consume it, 1.3% of Nairobi and Eastern, 1.1% of those in Northeastern, 0.9% in the Rift Valley, 0.8% in Eastern, and a negligible section of the population in Western. In Kenya, bang was officially made illegal under the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substance Control Act of 1994. There was a recent effort in April this year by writer and political analyst Gwada Ogot, who has petitioned Kenya Senate for decriminalization of marijuana, but more on that later. Heroin and cocaine. NACADA report that 0.1% of Kenyans, around 45,000 people, consume heroin, and that more than 75% of these are women. This is an alarming statistic, clearly requiring further study. It is also the case that the Kenyan coast is particularly heavily impacted. However, Kenya is primarily a transshipment and money laundering center for both heroin and cocaine, moving from Asia to markets in Europe and the USA. In April and November 2016, the Australian Navy seized 2 consignments of heroin off the Kenyan coast, totaling 787 kilos of heroin worth $278 million. In July, the police found 342 kilos of heroin in a tank of a ship docked at the Mombasa port, making it the biggest ever single seizure of heroin in Mombasa. The seizures roughly equaled the quantity seized by all East African governments between 1990 and 2009, according to the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. In December 2004, the Kenya government seized a vessel carrying 1.1 tons of cocaine at the port of Mombasa. This was the biggest seizure of its kind at the time. Since then, sizable seizures have been made in Mombasa, Malindi, and Nairobi. Indeed, Kenya, with its growing and sophisticated services sector, our banks, law firms, auditors, etc., is emerging as the most significant money laundering center on the eastern side of Africa. Research has found that one of the easiest places on earth to open a dummy company is Kenya. A recent biannual EY fraud survey found Kenya to be the 6th most corrupt country in the world. In Malindi, an entrenched Italian community that reportedly includes criminal elements is said to have helped facilitate the trade. Secondly, and significantly, the sheer scale of money being laundered through Kenya by cartels and networks reportedly also involved in human trafficking, terrorism finance, and the moving of all manner of illicit proceeds has had a damaging effect on key national governance institutions. Drug money has permeated our political class, with even known drug dealers being elected to public office, with them being sought by the US government and the US law. And it has undermined our judiciary, police, customs, and revenue collection authorities, amongst others. Kenya's handling of tobacco has shown that where there's a will, it is possible to implement policies that lead to a gradual decline in tobacco consumption. Seeking alternative agricultural commodities for tobacco farmers is also urgent. On alcohol, a more level-headed and holistic approach to its consumption and management of alcoholism, where it is not widespread but appears to severely impact specific sections of our population disproportionately, also makes eminent sense. With regard to bangi, heroin, and cocaine, the historical war against drugs that came out of the US in the 1970s and was ramped up in the 1980s has failed. It has led to a situation where a country that has 5% of the world's population has 25% of its prisoners, and profiles of this incarcerated population would indicate systemic discrimination against minority groups and the poor. As a result, a number of countries, including some states in the United States of America, are experimenting with deregulation of drugs for more efficient management of the problem. Portugal decriminalized the possession and use of small amounts of drugs for personal use in 2001. Partly as a result, it is believed, there are 3 drug overdose deaths in Portugal per 1 million citizens compared to 44.6 in the United Kingdom, 126.8 in Estonia, and the European Union average of 17.3 per 1 million citizens annually. In 2013, Uruguay legalized the manufacture, sale, and use of marijuana totally as part of an experimental program, in part to get the criminals out of the business. Ecuador, the Netherlands, Canada are part of a growing list of countries experimenting with more holistic approaches to the issue of drugs in society. There are lessons Kenya and other African countries could learn from this, especially given the fact that, according to the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime, Africa is the single largest producer of cannabis, bangi, in the world.